welcome to this week's slightly delayed edition of Film Jocks with Hitchcock, my year-long journey with the master of suspense. So today we're moving through the year 1931 with the film Rich and Strange. This was based on a 1930 book written by Dale Collins, and a year later the novel was adapted for film by Hitchcock himself. In the US, it was known by the title East of Shanghai. I don't know what the purpose of that was or the reasoning behind it, and anytime you try to get this movie nowadays, it's always called Rich and Strange. So we're just going to use the original title, and we're not even going to reference that East of Shanghai bit. For the first few talkies that Hitchcock tackled, I wouldn't say a majority of them have been that interesting so far. Blackmail was pretty good, but since then, a lot of the other ones have had similar issues where the story kind of falls apart halfway through. They don't really utilize the sound part of the film as well as Blackmail did. And with Rich and Strange, we are going to the same bottom of the barrel that Juno and the Paycock can be found, because this one is yet another Hitchcock entry that really does nothing for me. There's not a whole lot to say about this one, again, which is unfortunate because it is a bit of a comedy. It's a romantic comedy, but it just doesn't work. At the time, it was popular to do a film like this, something that had a screwball element to it. Think of something like It Happened One Night. Now, this movie could very well be one of those types of films, but I think the only problem is the main romantic interests are extremely unlikable, and the way the events unfold is very unnatural. It doesn't make sense. It's 83 minutes long, and the stuff that they rush really shouldn't be rushed at all. But yet there's other moments that feel like they drag on way too long. In fact, once we got to the ending of the film, you already got an idea of what the meaning of it all is. You have an idea of the moral they're trying to get across. And yet it goes on for another 15 minutes of not a whole lot going on. It's a very basic film that takes a story that could have been wrapped up in a matter of 40 minutes. This, to me, is not feature-length material. It doesn't really have a 3-act structure. It takes me back to Champagne, another film where the actual gist of the story didn't really start until about half hour into that movie, and even then the story that they had was very simplistic, had a very basic moral to it, and wasn't that interesting. Rich and Strange has a lot of the same issues. I think it's neat that Hitchcock had an admiration for the film. He worked on it with his wife, developed a screenplay, and they actually did some research where they traveled to Paris, and they acted as the innocent tourists. They were trying to find some kind of belly dance show, something that Hitchcock wanted to show in the film. And in the process, they were instead brought to a brothel, something that Hitchcock didn't expect. And he makes a joke about it in the Truffaut book. So I feel like he has a lot of good memories from the making of this film, but it's just too bad that the final product is not that great. It wasn't even well received at the time. It failed at the box office, and Hitchcock acknowledges this, but Hitchcock and Truffaut both really liked it. But anyway, as we get into the film, it starts with a quote from Shakespeare's The Tempest. "Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange." Hence where the title Rich and Strange comes from. Actually, there's quite a few of these intertitles that show up, and they show up in a way that's more similar to a silent film rather than modern-day sound films. It's actually kind of funny how some of the intertitles are used. In fact, many times when Fred is introduced on the screen, for some reason they have to repeatedly announce that Fred is on the screen by just putting the one name as a title card, Fred. I don't really understand the point of this, but it's kind of funny. There's a couple other good moments like that too, but it's just odd because for the most part, we've abandoned the intertitles up until this point, now that sound has been introduced. The movie begins with a very awesome sequence as businessmen are finishing their day. They all check out of work, they grab their coats, their umbrellas, and as they're going through the hallways, they also meet up with the women who work in the same building as they collide into one hallway. It works like a conveyor belt, and I think it gives this impression that working in the city is monotonous, it's tiring, it's like you're a cog in the machine, and it's a machine you want to break out of. They introduce that with the character Fred, who already doesn't fit in with this vibe. He's trying to read his newspaper on the train. He can't do it. There's not enough room. He's bumping into people. He's trying to open up this newspaper. He doesn't understand how to fold it and read it like a normal person, and it's getting wrecked. At one point, the train halts and he has to grab a woman's head to make sure he doesn't fall over. A lot of silent comedy going on in the first few minutes, and I think this sequence alone is very good. If you want to go check out the sequence, I would just look it up online and watch that, because the rest of the movie is not as good. As he gets home, he complains to his wife, who he's been married to for 8 years, that he's unhappy with his life. He wants something more exciting. It just so happens that his uncle is giving away some money. Kind of like Juno and the Paycock, actually. There's a lot of similarities between this film and Juno and the Paycock, and unfortunately, both of them are quite dull. So it's funny that after Juno and the Paycock, Hitchcock would jump onto another movie that has a very similar storyline, even down to the fact that it's about someone giving away some money and the family thinks they're rich. And then after that, it takes forever to get to the actual point. However, with Juno and the Paycock, where it has a very bad transfer at the moment and you can't really understand much of what they're saying, this film actually has a very nice Kino Blu-ray release. It was just released this year. The movie looks like it's in pristine condition. It's just unfortunate that there's an error in the audio. Yeah, so when we get about 19 minutes into the film, around the time the Mediterranean title card shows up, the sound is not the sound for the scene. It's actually sound from earlier in the film at the train station. So this was a weird error. And to be honest, had people not pointed it out online, I'm not even sure if I would have noticed, because there's no dialogue during these moments. At least it doesn't seem like there's supposed to be. But it is a little off. It doesn't really make sense. And I wonder if I would have seen it without reading the review first, if I would have just chalked it up to old school use of sound effects that don't match well with the film. But clearly, the sound is not meant to be where it is. And if you pay attention, it's the same exact track that's used earlier. And when one of our main leads, Emily, starts talking, then it goes back to the original track. What's weird is that people discover this is an error that's been present in almost every release of this film that's been done by a major company. The only one that seems to have avoided this is the Lionsgate DVD from 2007. So I don't know why the error happened, and in fact, Kino hasn't said much about it. What's really weird is that this was supposed to be released on Blu-ray about 2 years ago. It was going to be included in that Alfred Hitchcock set of the 5 movies that Kino did. But for some reason, Rich and Strange and Number 17 were canceled at the last moment, and we didn't see them released until now. And it made me wonder, were they doing more work on the film? And after watching the audio error, I'm wondering if they attempted to fix it, but maybe they couldn't find an audio source that doesn't have the error. But clearly there's a version that exists out there, because the Lionsgate DVD doesn't have the error, so they could have just gone for a low quality track for just a few minutes if they had to. But anyway, I don't understand why that error happened, and it is quite noticeable. I mean, granted, there's no dialogue during the scene, so maybe you wouldn't notice, but it is embarrassing. And it's embarrassing that it's been happening to so many previous releases, and that Kino, even with this new Blu-ray release, still kept the error on the set. But anyways, after they inherit this money, they travel all over the place. They go to Paris. There's this weird effect that they're doing where they're looking at like one side of the street and the other side of the street and looking at all the different things that are available for them to purchase, all these different experiences. And as they twist their necks, it's a weird choppy effect where it's cutting some frames out. So it makes for a really weird choppy looking effect. But honestly, I think it was meant for humor, and it is funny. So I guess it works. However, Fred gets seasick on the boat, and in the meantime, his wife Emily meets up with another man, and clearly they're falling in love. After that, Fred has gotten a little bit better since his seasickness, and falls in love with a princess. Yeah, there's a princess on board. I don't really understand the point of that. We find out later that she's not actually a princess and is just after his money, which, hey, there's another one. We had that in Downhill. A man who came into some money has his money taken away by a woman who then leaves him after the money's gone. So yet another story that Hitchcock is reverting back to. And granted, Hitchcock did that a lot in his later career, but I don't feel like these are the strongest movies to pull from. I mean, you're pulling from Downhill and Juno and the Paycock so far, and Champagne, and all of these are not that great. And unfortunately, I wouldn't say there's a whole lot of Hitchcock-esque film moments in this movie, because there wasn't a lot of interesting compositions or shots that I came out of it remembering, besides the opening sequence. There's a cool mirror shot when Fred leaves Emily to be with the princess. Emily walks into the room to warn her husband, or soon-to-be ex-husband, that the princess is not really a princess. She's just trying to take his money. And we actually see her reflection in the mirror as the princess stares her down in the same mirror. So that's kind of cool. They go to different shows and dances, and, at this point, that Hitchcock just loves showing off the dancing girls. There's this woman played by Elsie Randolph, who's just referred to as the old maid, who doesn't really have much of a role here except to be annoying, and everybody wants to get away from her, and she's just played to be this character that nobody has an affection for, even though our main characters are cheating on one another, even though they're married, and they broke up for a very stupid reason. There's like no development there whatsoever. We also have to throw in this old maid who ends up with no one, and I guess she's meant to be the butt of the joke. But honestly, it's not that funny when the rest of the characters are so extremely unlikable. When they do make their journey home, they end up on a boat, but this boat actually begins to sink, and they're locked in their room, and they really feel like they're about to die. They're getting to that point. They're watching the water rise through the window, which is a very interesting effect. But no worries, they escape through the window, and they're eventually saved by a Chinese junker boat. Now, earlier in the film, when Fred is with the princess at a hotel, there's a housekeeper that comes by, played by an Asian man, and he yells at him very loudly during a very intense scene between him and his wife. So I guess that makes sense, he's yelling, but why did it have to be at the cleaning person? I don't know. But now later in the movie, they have this Chinese junker boat that picks him up. And in the meantime, they go and scavenge around on the sinking boat, and one of the people die very randomly. It's one of the most stupid setups you can ever see for someone's death, but basically the guy falls and his leg gets caught in the rope and he can't lift himself up properly, so his head's just bobbing in the water and he drowns. It seems like he could easily escape from this. Nobody helps him either, which is very confusing, and I don't know what the comment is meant to be made at. Is this supposed to be, I'm gonna guess, a racist thing? Because it seems like we're already headed in that direction with some of the stereotypes they introduce, like the fact that they eat a cat, which is meant to be a joke. Fred and Emily are enjoying this dinner that they provided them, and they love the dinner, and then they realize it's the cat that they brought on board, the cat that they saved from their own boat. They see the cat's fur hung up on the side of the ship, and they realize they're drying it out because they killed a cat, and that's what we're eating right now. Chinese people, they eat cats. Huh? 1930s jokes, I guess. But I have to say, earlier when that other guy just dies and nobody helps him, I'm like, is it supposed to show that Chinese people are not emotive about things like this? That they're very passive about death happening and nobody has the will to help someone who's in need, especially in a situation like that, that seems pretty easy to get out of. I didn't understand the inclusion of these characters. And meanwhile, one of them is pregnant, has a baby on the boat, and Emily's super happy to see the baby, but she starts freaking out the second they're putting any water on the baby. But, Fred's like, no, don't worry, they know what they're doing. See that? They care for children. If they can do it, can anybody do it? They're just making a comment about, hey, isn't it interesting that these people from a different country know how to have children? It's like, okay, way to open up your mind. This doesn't seem like something that needs to be established. But again, it's the 1930s, and people were very naive. Maybe people were naive to something even as simple as that. Who knows, but nowadays it comes across as awkward. Not as awkward as a lot of racist bits from the 1930s, and especially some of the other Hitchcock films we've gone over. But it still makes me wonder, what was the point of including those characters? Meanwhile, Emily and Fred make it home. They realize they don't need all that money to live the life that they want, and spending all that money meant nothing to them, so they shouldn't be seeking riches in their life, and they should instead see what's in front of them right now. And, you know, they make it home, but of course, the humor of it is they start fighting again almost right away. It's a very awkward comedy that just doesn't work, is not funny. There's other movies from this year that are funny, so it's not like it's an age thing. It looks like even at the time, people didn't find this to be that humorous. So frankly, this has been one of my least favorite of the Hitchcock films so far. Luckily, it's short enough. I didn't find it to be a struggle to sit through, but those last 15 minutes were pretty long. It was starting to stretch itself out, especially when you establish the characters as people you don't want to see win. You don't want to see them win, and you can make a movie like that, a comedy like that, about characters you don't want to see succeed. But they frame this as a movie where they do succeed. You know, they're still somewhat fighting at the end, but they play that more like it's meant to be relatable. Well, I don't relate to these characters. This movie would probably be a 2 out of 5 stars, if not a 1.5 out of 5 stars. I think it's time to move on to the next film, number 17, which also has a Kino release, which also happened to be released very recently on Blu-ray. But in the meantime, thanks so much for listening to this episode. Let me know your thoughts on Rich and Strange, some of the other Hitchcock movies we've gone over, and if you want to join me for the next episode, give number 17 a watch, and we'll see you next time.
This concludes my part of the program. Next time, I shall return with another story.